Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's hearing me correctly. My name is Christian. I'm Enerdata's head of marketing, and welcome to this Global Energy Trends webinar. I think you're all pretty familiar with Enerdata. Every year we present this analysis. So at Enerdata, we put actual figures on key issues because there's been obviously lots of talks about the energy and climate issues over the last few months. So our role at Enerdata is to quantify and to put actual data, in front of these talks. So especially where do we stand in terms of the energy transition, in terms of energy consumption, energy supply, and all the drivers of decarbonization. So this is what we're going to do today. So perhaps we can jump to the next slide, please. So today we have Geraldine, who is a senior analyst at Enerdata. Hi, Geraldine.
Hi, everybody.
And Quentin Bikini, it's always pretty hard to pronounce, sorry, who's a project manager with us for a few years. Hi.
Hello, everyone. No worries about the pronunciation.
All right, perhaps we can jump to the next slide to take a look at the agenda. So first of all, we're going to be analyzing the key statistics. So Enerdata is the first organization to actually release the consolidated actual statistics of 2022. So we're going to take a deep dive into those statistics. Then we're going to analyze the trends by types of energy, to which extent coal, oil and other energies are growing. Then the third part of this presentation is going to be about the global stocktake. As you know, there's soon going to be a next COP, and this is one of the key topics that is going to be discussed at the COP. And the last topic will be the European gas crisis and its implications. So now we have a pretty clear picture of the real implication, especially the answer to the question, the key question being, does it favor energy transition or not? Right. So we have about 300 people listening today. Thanks for your interest. Please feel free to ask any question that you may have in the question chat box on your Zoom interface, and we'll be answering those questions insofar as we can. We make our best to answer all the questions. All right. So I guess we can start. So the floor is yours, Quentin, to start then.
Hello. So I will start. Not Quentin.
Sorry about that. Well, go ahead, Geraldine. Yeah.
So I will start with the analysis of last year with the key energy figures and trends. So let's have a look at the key energy and climate figure for the G20. So we have three metrics: economic growth, energy consumption, and CO2 emissions. So these three metrics grew in 2022 at a much slower pace than in the year before, but still they continue to increase. So economic growth and energy consumption grew at their average rate, so about 3% per year for economic growth. Energy consumption grew by around 2% per year for energy consumption, as in the previous trend. And CO2 emissions, they continue to increase by around 2% in 2022. It's significantly slower than in the year before, but much faster than in the historical period. It's also higher than energy consumption, so it's problematic in terms of carbon factor. So let's have a look at economic growth, which was the main driver for energy consumption and CO2 emission. So the economic growth was sustained in in 2022, about 3% per year. So this is the return to the average trend. It grew by around 3% in the OECD and by more than 3.5% in non-OECD countries. So in OECD countries, Europe succeeded in having about 4% growth despite regional uncertainties, mainly the war in Ukraine. In the United States, the growth was also sustained with 2%. It's the historical trend. And in OECD Asia, such as Japan or Korea, it was a second year of growth sustained by exports and domestic demand. So all our graphs are based on the same model. You have in gray 2020, 21 in blue, last year 22 in orange, and the green circles are for the historical trend. So you can compare the recent evolution and the historical trend. And you have the name of the zones and their share in the indicator. So for instance, here you have China, who accounted for 24% of the G20 GDP. So in last year, there was an economic slowdown in China. The GDP grew by around 3%, which is significantly lower than the year before, about 8%. So this was due to the zero COVID policy. There was the Shanghai lockdown in early 22. There were also several lockdowns or factories shut down during the year. So that had a strong impact on industrial demand, on domestic consumption too. There was a sluggish domestic demand too, that reduced imports, or that slowed down imports. And there was also in China the real estate crisis. So the real estate sector who had been growing by around, who had been surging in the last 20 years, until accounting for 30% of Chinese GDP, went into a crisis, and this had an impact on the construction sector, on energy-intensive sectors, or very important sectors such as cement, steel, furniture, appliances. So it had a huge impact on Chinese GDP, which only grew by 3%. But there was also a strong economic growth in India, in Indonesia. Indonesia, the GDP grew by more than 5%. It's a historical level. In Saudi Arabia, spurred by oil exports. In Brazil and in India, it was pre-electoral years, so there were increased public investments, and there was also a strong increase in domestic demand. So it was a year of growth in many G20 countries, except for Russia, where the GDP fell by 2%. This is mainly due to the Western sanctions that hit the Russian industry. So where energy consumption is concerned, energy consumption grew by around 2% in 2022. It's slower than the economic growth, so there is a kind of decoupling. There were two drivers: Asia, so as I said, China, even if the growth in China was slower than the year before, in Indonesia, India, and also in the United States. So this energy consumption was directly related to the growth, to the economic growth. On the other hand, there was a strong decrease in energy consumption in Europe. So it was mainly due to the war in Ukraine and fears of gas supply disruption. So energy consumption declined strongly in Europe. It also declined in Russia due to the sanctions that hit the industrial sector. So this decline in Europe was offset by a growth in United States and Canada, which are huge energy producers. So overall, there was a stagnation in energy consumption in the OECD. There was also a slight decline in Japan and moderate growth in Korea and Australia. Outside the OECD, the growth was more than 3% in the growth in energy consumption. So 3% in China as for the GDP. A sustained growth in India, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia, so directly linked to the economic growth. And the energy consumption also declined in Russia. So now let's see. Energy intensity. So there was a reduction in energy intensity last year, but this reduction was...
Maybe we can define energy intensity.
Yes,
maybe
of course.
helpful.
Yes, energy intensity is the ratio between energy consumption and GDP. So basically, it's the amount of energy you need to produce $1 of GDP. So it shows all your economy needs energy to move ahead. So as you can see on the graph, energy intensity has been declining more or less rapidly in the last decade. And it has been declining too. It declined also last year, but not that much. So there was a reduction in the OECD that was due to the strong decrease in energy consumption in Europe. So as we saw, energy consumption declined in Europe, or slowed down in Europe, while the GDP continued to grow. So it was kind of forced sufficiency. There was also a slight decline in Japan and virtual stagnation in the United States. So in the United States, energy consumption and GDP grew by almost the same rate. That was also the case in China, where the GDP and energy consumption grew by 3%. So no evolution for China. There was a slight increase in India or in Russia and a slight decline in Brazil. So not a real improvement in energy intensity. And as you can see on the second graph, the G20 energy intensity evolution, you can see the average trend since 2000, and it's a reduction of about 1.5% per year, and we would need more than 3.5% per year to reach the 2-degree target. So we are far from improving our energy intensity, or at least not enough. So where CO2 emissions are concerned, there was new growth in 2022 to record level. Emissions also exceeded the 2019 level. So they continued to increase by nearly 2%. They stagnated in the OECD because there was a growth in the United States, in Mexico, in Canada. Energy consumption grew in those countries, but it declined in Europe. So overall, it offsets and it nearly stagnated. In the OECD, emissions are still below their 2019 level, but the new growth is, this slight growth is concerning. Sorry. Outside OECD, emissions grew by 4%. So emissions slowed down in China they grew by 1%, but emissions soared in India, nearly 9%, in Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. So these countries are very CO2 intensive. Their economies rely on coal or on oil. So every time they consume energy, it's very carbonated energy, and their emissions continue to increase. So as you see on the second graph, with the energy-related CO2 emissions, so overall for the G20, you see this new increase in 2022 and what would be required to reach the 2-degree target. So we are, again, far from this level. So the carbon factor is an indicator. It measures CO2 emissions compared to energy consumption. So if the energy you consume is more or less carbonated, depends on coal, your use of coal, oil, etc. So as you can see in the G20, on average, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, emission declined by less than 1% per year, and we would need more than 3% per year reduction to reach the 2 degrees pathway. So that's considerably concerning. This is due to a power generation mix and energy consumption, which is still very carbon intensive. So power generation at the G20 level is still 60% thermal, and coal consumption grew in the last 2 years. So this is particularly concerning. There was a degradation of the carbon factor in the EU because we used more coal to generate power. in India, in Russia. There was a slight improvement in the United States because the US power sector is increasingly using gas and renewables instead of coal, but it's not enough. And there were also a lower carbon factor in China because China is trying to reduce the share of coal in its power mix. So as you can see on the second graph, we are always further the 2-degree pathway.
You're right. This graph is quite worrying because not only it's bad, but we keep moving away from the target.
Indeed. And even in years like last year, when we have a slower economic growth and a slower energy consumption, we still have a very high carbon factor. So we don't know exactly what would be needed, or we know what would be needed, but we are not implementing it to reach this 2-degree pathway. So let's have a look.
And by the way, at Data, we have the tools to kind of quantify the options that are available. And we do that for government bodies, for example. But yeah, as you say, we know and we can quantify that, but then it's a matter of implementation.
Yes, let's have a look at energy consumption by energy. So let's start with a global overview, where you have all the information of what happened last year. So as I said, energy consumption slowed down to its historical trend as economic growth. Where energies are concerned, there was a slowdown in coal consumption, but still it's nearly 4%. So it's nearly 10 times. It's nearly 10 times faster than the historical trend. And coal still accounts for 32% of the G20 energy consumption. So this is concerning. As well, oil consumption has slightly slowed down. It's nearly 2% growth, but it's twice the historical trend. And it still accounts for nearly 30% of the G20 energy consumption. Where gas is concerned, gas consumption declined in 2022. It was due to the strong reduction in Europe and in other countries that were impacted by very high LNG prices. So this is not, this was a very particular year, and it cannot be compared with the historical trends or the 2 years before. And for electricity, electricity consumption slowed down and almost reached its pre-crisis level. So let's start with coal. So as I said, coal consumption grew by nearly 4% in 2022. It was spurred by Asian coal producers. So like China, where coal consumption grew by 4%, in India, where coal consumption grew by 9%, and in Indonesia, where it grew by 15%. So these countries are major coal users. These 3 countries, they account for nearly 3/4 of the G20 coal consumption. So that's very important. There was also a second year of growth in coal consumption in the EU, which is due to the increase in gas prices. Well, coal prices also increased, but not to the level for gas. So there was an increase in coal consumption in the EU, and also in Russia, where it grew by nearly 7%. So this is a gloomy overview, but on the other way, there were some noticeable declines. So in the United States, which still account for 6% of the G20 coal consumption, thanks to the replacement of coal-fired power plants by gas-fired power plants and by renewable plants. In other coal producers and consumers that don't appear on this graph, such as Australia or South Africa, they had supply issues. They had very intense rains and floodings that disrupted the coal production. In South Africa, there was also the coal consumption in coal-fired power plants by Eskom, which are aging and which are plagued with many problems. So coal consumption in South Africa is still declining. But on the second graph, you can see that even if the coal consumption in the G20 OECD is slightly declining, in non-OECD countries, like China, India, Indonesia, coal consumption is really soaring and has more than doubled since 2000. Where oil is concerned, oil consumption continued to increase in 2022 by nearly 2%. As well, we can see that it has been rising since 2000, especially non-OECD countries, which are increasingly consuming energy. China accounts for 20% of the G20 energy consumption, the United States for nearly 1/4. So last year was marked by surging world oil prices and the global economic slowdown. Still economic growth, but a slowdown compared to the year before. So there was even a slight decline in China, where oil consumption dipped by 1.6%, mainly due to the zero COVID policy and to the not the economic crisis, but the slowdown in industrial consumption. And it also grew at moderate pace in the US and EU. So either a slight decline in China or a small growth in these three main consumers. So that's why the growth in last year was so moderate. It also slightly declined in Japan or Korea, and even dipped by 4% in Russia. On the other hand, oil consumption soared in India, in Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia by more than 10%. So these three countries, which had very strong economic growth, consumed more and more oil. Oil consumption also grew in Canada or in Brazil, where there are, because these are producing countries. So where gas is concerned, we noticed a 1.4% decline last year, and this was due to the war in Ukraine, either because the consuming countries were directly or were neighboring Ukraine, or because this war had a huge impact on energy consumption, on gas prices globally. So as you can see, gas consumption fell by 12% in the European Union, which accounted for 12% of the G20 consumption. So it was the largest drop in gas consumption posted last year. So there were several factors to explain this fall. Soaring gas prices. Well, gas prices were already rising the year before, but last year, the war in Ukraine spurred gas prices to record highs. So these record prices incited industrial and residential consumer to reduce their consumption. There were also fears of Russian gas supply disruption that also reduced consumption, and a mild winter, that reduced gas demand for heating. So if you need more details about gas in Europe, you can ask Quentin. Gas consumption also declined in Russia, which is one of the major gas consumer in the G20. So that was due to lower industrial demand, as the Russian industry was hit by sanctions. Gas consumption also declined in India because when Europe decided to find alternative sources for gas, they turned to LNG, and this contributed to raise Asian LNG prices. So that impacted India, which needs gas, but not at any price. So gas consumption declined by 6% in India. Outside, there was a slight drop in China. Outside OECD, there was a slight drop in China by 1%. It's the first drop in gas consumption in China in 30 years. So that's noticeable. So that was due to gas prices and also to the industrial slowdown. And on the other hand, there was a strong growth in gas consumption in the United States and in Canada because there are gas producers, and the North America gas market was not impacted. The increase in gas prices that occurred in Europe or Asia did not occur in Canada or United States. So this gas prices also reduced gas consumption in South Korea and in Japan. So that was a very particular year for gas consumption. Where electricity is concerned, there was a slower growth in electricity demand, about 2% in last year, like in the historical trend. So it's a return to a normal trend. The share of electricity in final energy consumption is still growing. It was 24% last year. It's above the 2019 level. So in the OECD, electricity consumption was rather stable. It slightly grew, well, not slightly, but increased significantly in the United States and South Korea, in Mexico and Canada. And this was offset by a decline in the EU and in Japan. And outside OECD, there was a strong growth in China. And a growth in India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Brazil. Where the power mix is concerned, there are good news and bad news. So in 2022, we had a less carbon-intensive power mix because we had a strong increase in solar and wind power generation, and their share in the G20 power mix continued to increase. There was also a slight increase in hydropower generation by more than 1%. That was partly offset by a nearly 5% drop in nuclear power generation, especially in Europe, especially in Germany and France, where nuclear power plants were shut down definitely or for maintenance and retrofit. There were also reduced hydropower availability, so lower operation of nuclear power plants in France, and also strikes. So there was, the power mix was less carbon intensive at the G20 level, but still dominated by thermal power. If you consider coal, gas, and oil, these three energies account for 60% of the power mix, 62 if you take biomass into account. And as you can see, their share in the G20 power mix has significantly declined since in the last 10 years, but now it's averaging 60%. And there was also an increase in thermal power generation last year, with a new increase in coal-fired power generation in the EU. So improvements, but there is still this share of coal in the power mix, in the installed capacity and in the power mix, that is dominating the mix. So to finish with good news, there was a strong growth in wind generation in China and in the United States last year. Their wind power generation grew by more than 50%. It also grew in Brazil. So this was spurred by a new increase in wind power capacity. Overall, in the world, there were more than 75 gigawatts of new wind power capacity that were installed. China accounted for half of this new installation. So it's a significant slowdown if you compare with the last 2 years, but still 37 gigawatts, it's very, very impressive. There were sustained installations in the EU with 16 gigawatts and in the United States with 8 gigawatts. So China, the United States, and the EU are the three main markets for wind power. If you see the first graph, you can see that China is dominating everything with nearly 800 terawatt hour of wind power generation, which is twice the level of wind power generation in EU and the US, and also other G20 countries. So if you see this graph, you can see that wind power generation in the United States or in EU is at the same level as other G20 countries. And it's rising. Where solar is concerned, there was an acceleration in new installation in 2022. As you can see, installations accelerated in the EU, in China, where they reached 86 gigawatts, sorry. They also increased in India. They slightly declined in the United States, but remained very sustained. there was also overall in the G20 countries, solar power generation grew by 27%. So that was due to a strong growth in the four main producers. China, where wind power, solar power generation, grew by nearly 1/3. In the EU, 27%, the United States, 24%, and in India, nearly 40%. There were also increases in Brazil and in Japan. So we cannot represent all the countries due to scale problem, because when you have China, it makes all the other small players. But anyway, solar installations are growing everywhere, also in Brazil or in Japan. So to sum up last year, to remember, we can remember that global economy and energy consumption went back to their historical growth. There were 2 points, the slowdown in China in energy consumption and the impact of the war in Ukraine on Europe, which reduced gas consumption and slowed down energy consumption. So we will see in Europe if this will continue. And except for Europe, where we had economic growth but decline in energy consumption, we can notice that energy consumption is still following economic growth. So there is no decoupling between economy and energy consumption, and the energy intensity remains stable. So we will see how consumption will rebound in Europe, and if sufficiency policies are temporary or structural. To remember too, the 2% increase in CO2 emissions. So this was due to the permanence of coal in the power mix and the increase in coal-fired power generation. So the energy mix has not evolved favorably, especially in Europe, and the share of fossil fuel is not decreasing. So we will have to accelerate renewable power generation if we want to reach the 2-degree target. So the good news is that renewable production is still increasing rapidly, 27% for solar and 30% for wind, and new installation remains steady even in crisis years like 2020. And also for renewable power generation, we can remember that China accounts for nearly half of renewable installation, 45% of solar installations and 50% of wind installations. And finally, we will see the pre-COVID trends and will continue, and what will be the long-term impacts of the Russia-Ukraine conflicts, what happens in terms of energy consumption, energy mix, and prices.
Well, thanks, Geraldine. Maybe we can handle a couple of questions prior to jumping to the next section. So first of all, there was a question about energy intensity. What exactly energy intensity term demonstrates? Does it show an increase in efficiency of energy use, or does it show decline in production and an increase of the weight of services in GDP?
I think they're both. There is an increase in efficiency in the energy use because industries and yes, industrial consumers and even the automotive sector is improving and is producing more efficiently. So I think there is an energy efficiency effect, but there is also this structural change in indeed the weight of services in GDP. You also have the weight of energy intensive sectors or industrial branch in the industry sector. So I think they are both.
Okay. And there's another question about the oil consumption. So is the oil consumption for power generation only, or does it also include the transportation sector? And if second, what is the share of both? So I believe here with these slides, we're covering all sectors of the economy. Of course, we can drill down further, and we do drill down further in our databases, but those graphs are all sectors combined, right?
Yes, it's the primary consumption for oil, so it includes the energy sector, energy used also to produce oil, if you need, and
so,
the final consumption.
Yeah. And to figure out the share of both in every country, you will need to deep dive into the databases. Okay. Then there's another question about the outlook. What are the projections country by country, wind and solar energy production over the next 5 years? Double again? And this is a very good question. And by the way, we also do have a tool to measure this, namely our power plant tracker, where we have all the power generation projects across the globe. So with this tool, you can actually come up with a 5-year power mix forecast. Yeah. So I don't think we have this on the top of our head, but yes, the renewables production is due to increase at least at that pace in the near future. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we can move on and handle the questions maybe later on, because there's lots of them. Okay. No, I guess it's Quentin's turn, right?
Yes, it is.
Well, thanks, Geraldine.
Okay, so thank you, Geraldine, and thank you, Christian, for the introduction. So now we're going to talk a lot about the same basically elements, same metrics and results that we've presented here, but we are going to take a step back and not just look at the last couple of years, and also try to more or less focus on sort of echoing the Global Stocktake, which is a process that is taking place currently. I'm going to give you a bit more insight on this in the next slides. But the purpose is to basically look at how CO2 emissions have evolved since the Paris Agreement, and more specifically look into the drivers of this evolution. So do I have control over the slide? I do. So first of all, what is the Global Stocktake that we wanted to talk about today? So the Global Stocktake is an element basically of the Paris Agreement. The purpose is to assess basically what has been done since the Paris Agreement. So if you look at the different timelines on the right, you see that basically the process has started in 2021 with basically data collection, input collection from the different parties of the Stocktake. Then there was a long period of assessment, analysis of the data, and there were different reports, technical assessment reports that were published. But the real outcome is the synthesis report that is expected by the end of 2023, basically around the time of the next COP. The Global Stocktake, the efforts should be reproduced every 5 years. So really with an updated view of what has been done, and is it in line with the expectation of the Paris Agreement. The three main components that we would be looking for from the report are, what are the measures that have been implemented, what is the effort remaining, and some policy recommendation basically. Our vision, our opinion of this process, looking at the different technical assessments and talking to people involved, is that there are some limitations, obviously, to any sort of process. The main issue that we see is that it's a global approach. So we're not going to point fingers at different countries and how they implemented the different levels of actions that have been implemented. So you're lacking this sort of country or regional perspective, or even looking at the different sectors and trying to assess to have a refined assessment of what has been going on. And also that I don't think this is going to be a very quantified analysis, and especially what we'll be interested in and what we'll be trying to do here is sort of benchmark what has happened versus a more of an ideal trajectory. So this is our contribution, basically. So I've alluded to the limitations as we see them, and our contribution here is very modest. Or at least we do that with a lot of humility, but we are hoping that we can put forward a vision as a complement to the official process, and offer, so try to compensate for these perceived limitations. So breaking down the analysis into regional and sectoral assessments, and also try to compare what has happened with trajectories that come from our future scenarios. So future is a product that we update every year, where we basically derive our long-term vision of global energy systems into 3 different scenarios. The most relevant here are blue. Blue is a scenario which is based on basically countries achieving their NDCs, so the nationally determined commitments, as we interpret them. And green, which is a scenario which aims at maintaining a temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. But you might ask, why is there a difference between the two? There is a difference between the NDCs and an actual ideal trajectory. This is something that we commonly refer to as the emissions gap. Countries may have had published their commitments, but they're not necessarily in line with what would be the ideal evolution of emissions and the course of actions to get there. This is basically a first exercise, that it's still very top-down level, like top level, but we hope that this will lead to further publications and further exploration into the topic. So let's now look at the first results that we have from this approach, looking at more specifically here global emissions since the COP21 in Paris. So first of all, I have to introduce, for those who are not familiar with this concept, I have to introduce the Kaya identity, or Kaya equation, which is basically a simplistic but quite useful and most importantly easily replicable methodology to basically break down the evolution of emissions in a given country, but sort of break down into different main drivers on an economy level. So this is basically like this: CO2 emissions equal population multiplied by GDP by population, which is commonly referred to as the GDP per capita, which indicates, so the population is the demography, which has an impact on energy consumption and therefore emissions. Then you have basically the level of wealth of a given country given by the GDP per capita. Then you have the energy intensity, so energy consumption on GDP, which is Geraldine provided with an explanation earlier. So just the amount of energy consumption for a unit of GDP, and the CO2 emissions on the energy consumption, which is also commonly referred to as the emission factor or the carbon factor, which indicates the level of carbon emissions on the energy consumption. So this is a economy-wide approach so this is quite a raw and really top-level approach. You can also do a more refined, more granular sectoral analysis by including more specific drivers, especially with regards to activity. For example, here we have population and GDP per capita, but if you look at the industry sector, ideally you would want to look at industrial production by branch, and if you look at the transportation sector, you would look at traffic, for example, and you would be able to, the problem with the availability of these indicators, but you would be able to have a much more refined analysis of the evolution of emissions. So let's now look at what we have in terms of figure by applying this methodology. So the first chart on the top right is basically the evolution of CO2 emissions between 2015, so the year of COP21, and 2022 right now. So these are estimated. We do have the actual data for the G20 as presented by Geraldine. The rest is a sort of extrapolation of trends and looking at actually the different drivers that we've introduced earlier. And so what we have is we have a population effect that accounts for approximately 3 gigatons of CO2, and a GDP per capita effect that accounts for an additional 5 gigatons of CO2. But in the meantime, so between 2015 and 2022, we've seen a reduction in energy intensity and more modest reduction of the emission factor, which has led us to 38 gigatons, so an increase of around 2 gigatons of CO2 since 2015. But the methodology that I've introduced allows us to sort of break down and say what was the impact of each given driver, all of the things being equal, basically. So this is a first observation, is that emissions have continued to increase, which is not very intuitive if you think that in 2015 we're going to start implementing and start to go towards the goal of the Paris Agreement and start implementing the NDCs, and we end up with an increase in emissions. Now, because there is also an increase in activity, you could have expected that there was going to be a slight increase in the first years, then a plateau, and then going down to reach our objectives in 2030 and 2050. So what we wanted to do is sort of complement that with a different calculation, which is basically, and that's the chart on the bottom right, which is basically what could we have expected actually in 2015. And well, first of all, one thing that's important is the projections, and we've used the projections that we used at the time for scenarios. The GDP projections were much more ambitious, were higher than what we actually observed, obviously because of COVID, but not just that. So if we were to take, and starting from 2015, if we were to take the initial GDP projections that we had at the time, we would have had a much bigger impact on emissions. So here we see that +3 for population that hasn't changed much, but +8 gigatons of CO2 due to the increase in GDP per capita. So you end up at a much higher point, but looking at energy intensity, which as per our scenarios would have been the levels that we would have expected in 2022 to be in line with the Paris Agreement, we would have had a much bigger cut in emissions due to energy intensity and emission factor being reduced. And we would have ended up, despite a higher economic growth, we would have ended up at 35 gigatons of CO2, so lower than we actually are. So basically, not only did we have a lower than expected economic growth, but despite of that, we weren't able to reduce emissions, which we should have expected to happen in 2015 if we had implemented the necessary measures to be in line with the Paris Agreement. So this is our take on it. Now, this is more or less the same result. So now we're going to more explicitly present our scenarios that I mentioned earlier. So inner blue, the blue line, which is the scenario that is in line with the achievement of the NDCs, and inner green, which is a scenario that's a bit more ambitious because it's the guarantee that we will have a temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. The gray line is basically what we've seen historically, and the dotted line afterwards is after 2022 is basically an extrapolation of the trends that we've seen since 2015. So we can very clearly see that we're not on par with the objective as early as even in 2022. And if we continue like this, if we just extrapolate trends from 2015 to 2022, it's only going to get worse, right? Looking a little bit into more of a regional breakdown of that analysis, we see that it's basically the case in all countries considered. Here we have the European Union on the left, the US in the middle, and China on the right. And we see that, again, the historical trends are not enough to have something that's compatible with the Paris Agreement. That's something that you can observe on the energy intensity, which is on the top, and the carbon factor at the bottom. The only thing that's more or less in line with at least our expectation is actually the reduction of the carbon factor in China for now. But there needs to be a much higher decreasing trend after 2030. So that might explain it. It's that our trajectory up to 2030 was not very ambitious. So we've seen this sort of global analysis and really top level analysis. So we're still going to have something that's very top level, I suppose, but this is a first attempt to try to break down this analysis into different sectors. And we're going to still be looking at these three particular zones, so the EU and the US and China. and look at the different sectors and how have emissions evolved and why, basically. So first here we have the industry, so the manufacturing industry, actually, to be more precise. And we also looked at, we took a bit more of a step back here, and we tried to go back to at least 2010 to really be able to measure the evolution of the indicators that we integrated into this analysis, this assessment. So what we see is, usually very different dynamics in terms of activity, and that's something that you'll see in the other sectors as well. So in China, obviously, the production of the industry sector has increased quite a lot since 2010, and this, all other things being equal, again, would have, more than double the emissions from the industry sector in China. But what happened is that we basically had a lot of energy efficiency. Well, I guess that's a bit of a shortcut because it's basically energy intensity. But yeah, we assume, because we take into account more or less the structural effect. So you could have, for example, an increase on average of the industrial activity, but maybe going away from industries that are much more energy intensive. This is at least partly taken into account in industrial production, because we did take into account to an extent the structural effect. But I suspect that it's also reflected in the efficiency measures as well, because we don't have a fully perfectly granular vision of the industry. So yeah, basically efficiency offsetting almost entirely the increase in the industrial production, and then you had a lot of not relatively to efficiency, but significant fuel switching. So emission reduction through fuel switching, meaning switching of from coal to natural gas, for example, or from natural gas or oil to electricity, switching of fuels in the use of fuels in industry, which has led to a reduction in emissions. And we end up with emissions that are lower than in 2010. In the US, emissions are more or less stable. In the European Union, it's decreased, but not a lot, right? And thus, this is despite an increase in industrial production, which is really moderate. Looking at the transport sector, more or less the same observations here in terms of evolution of activity. In China, it has been massive, and it's had obviously a massive impact on emissions. In the US and the EU, not so much. Interestingly, we see that modal shift, which is something that we're able to capture and to isolate. So basically shifting from a more virtuous mode of transportation, for example, public transport, towards cars, or from rail transport for freight to road transport by truck. And this is something that we talk a lot about in terms of being a driver for reducing emissions in the transport sector. But historically, since 2000, we went a little bit further back here. Since 2000, it's actually had a negative effect, right? In terms of efficiency, in China, it's actually quite it's very little, but it's actually had a positive impact on emissions, so it has increased emissions. In the US and European Union, it's relatively moderate compared to what we could have expected. What happened is that this is really efficiency, but maybe a larger definition. We're not just talking about motor vehicle efficiency, right? This is also in a certain way an energy intensity of transportation, and you have on the one hand higher consumption standard per vehicle, more efficiency, but on the other hand that's partly offset by negative effects, which in this case is the occupancy rate. So less people per vehicle is something that a trend that you can observe historically, but also a lot due to the increase in the vehicle weight, which has reduced the efficiency, in a larger sense of road transport. Then you have a little component of electricity. So we have a lot of momentum for electric vehicles. This has not played a huge impact so far. This is something that we expect for more like the coming years. But we did have, electrification of train transport, for example, rail transport. And also, especially in Europe, some biofuels, which has reduced emissions. But again, same. So in China, the efforts of efficiency and fuel switching have not offset at all the increase in activity. In the US and the European Union, a very moderate increase in activity that's been barely or at all been offset by efficiency and fuel switching. Finally, we're going to look at the building sector, so residential and tertiary sector. Again, an increase in activity, not as big as what we've seen for industry and transportation in China, but there's been an increase in population and also some tertiarization, so an increase in the sector, the tertiary sector as a whole. Some fuel switching, very little energy intensity gains in China, so you end up with higher emissions. Interestingly, in Europe, you see that the impact that the green days have had on emissions. So the green days being, a metric that is used to evaluate the need for heating, so space heating and space cooling, actually. So it's basically a difference on average for a day between the temperature that is observed and the a temperature that you would ideally have, like a reference temperature for the in households. So here we're comparing 2010 and 2022. It turns out that 2022 was a much milder winter in Europe than it was in 2010. So you have this big impact of the green days. So before congratulating ourselves on the decrease in emissions, we should note that there's a big difference between the years that we are looking at in that regard. So again, for the US and the European Union, very moderate increase in activity, but we failed to really offset that with measures that would, fuel switching and reduction in energy intensity. So to sum up, what we've seen in the first part is that, in our opinion, but I think it's pretty transparent, we've seen efforts to reduce energy intensity and carbon factor on a global level, but it's not sufficient or in line at all with the Paris Agreement. The CO2 emissions have continued to increase despite an economic growth that has been actually lower than expected. You can see that on a global level and also on a regional level in China, the US, and Europe. The trends are improving, but it's not sufficient. If you look at the different sectors, you see different regional dynamics. In China, activity has increased significantly. Wealth also has probably driven up emissions, especially in sectors such as transportation. There has been some offsetting of this effect, especially in the industry sector with a higher energy efficiency. But overall, obviously, the emissions have increased quite a lot. What you see in the developed economies that we looked at, so in the EU and the US, is that activity has increased, but not a lot. And still, we weren't able to reduce emissions significantly or at all. To maybe end on a more positive note, so there are some important drivers that have been identified and they've not been fully activated. So that's something that you can observe. We failed to activate to use these drivers, but it's mostly something that you could expect in the coming years. So this could be, you could see a big changes in the trends if we were to implement these drivers on a large scale. So the first one that comes to mind is electrification. So being able to electrify, especially heating, so heating in the residential sector or the service sector, but also in the industry, especially through heat pumps, and transportation, so electric vehicles. We should observe a ramp up of these of electrification in these sectors, and this had the double benefit of well, first of all, especially for heat pumps and electric vehicles, having big energy efficiency gains, but also to lower emissions. But direct emissions, at least, it would only lower emission if we, in the same time, decarbonize electricity generation and gas, by the way. And this is something that we expect to ramp up in the coming years with the expansion, the global expansion of renewables that is expected. A few other elements that we think are important is renovating buildings. We should really ramp up the pace at which we renovate buildings, especially in developed economies. It's not as much of an issue in developing countries, because basically the sector is on the rise, right, with a demographic increase. So the park, right, of dwellings is getting renewed on a higher level. Finally, some changes appear to us to be essential, and would be great if we could trigger these elements that are mentioned here, especially energy sufficiency. So basically a decrease in energy needs, not just energy consumption through energy efficiency, more efficient equipment, but really just reduce wastes and reduced energy use as a whole. Other aspects that we can mention that could play a role is, having a more circular economy and more sharing economy, which would help us not only directly reduce emissions, but also, indirectly by, reducing the need for industrial products, for example. So this is all I have for the global stocktake. Do you want to say a few words at this point? Take a few questions, Christian.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Yeah, like we said at the beginning of this webinar, it's at least we have some, we have some views, we have some options in sight. But then, of course, comes the issue of international cooperation and also, policy frameworks and all, and especially, the cost of this transition and fund this transition, fund the innovation and fund the everything that is needed. And in this respect, the financial sector will have to play a key role. So in terms of timekeeping, it's actually noon, so I think we're pretty much on track. So that's the last section to cover, and let's try and fast track it to leave room for a couple of questions at the end.
Okay, just for my information, Christian, did we plan up to noon 30 or?
Well, I think that'd be probably like 12:15, 20.
Right, so
12:20 would be a good target for for people not to starve.
Yeah,
at least people in the CET time zone.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to speed up through this one. Okay, so now we're going to have a focus on what has happened in Europe, what we refer to as a natural gas crisis, right? So the issues that we have in terms of gas supply, and how did we basically adapt to these issues. So first of all, in this analysis, we used 2019 as a reference year because we thought, we could have looked at 2021 and looked at what happened in 2022 compared to 2021, but we fear that maybe 2021 was not very representative in terms of gas consumption because we were still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So just as a disclaimer here, this is mostly referring to 2019 versus 2022. So what did we observe in 2019 with regards to gas consumption and gas importations? Well, first of all, as you probably all know, the EU was and is still very dependent on natural gas importations, right? So we basically produce only 15% of the gross natural gas consumption, and we import the rest. From these importations, Russia is obviously a huge part of that, with more than 40%. The rest is basically Norway and some, imports by pipeline from Algeria, among others, and LNG imports as well, which makes the total. Now, on the right, we can see what basically, well, first of all, what Russian imports represent compared to the total natural gas consumption, but also you can see how it is well spread, this consumption between the different sectors, with power generation being a big one, industry as well, but also residential and the services sector. Basically, only transport is marginal. A quick, summary of what has happened in terms of prices, which gives us it's a good proxy for what has happened overall in terms of situation, in terms of natural gas supply and demand. So you can see, first of all, that the prices have started to increase well before the war in Ukraine. we were in a context of, post-pandemic economic rebound, and there was a lot of demand, especially coming from Asia, not only because of the economic rebound, but there was, this notion of, transitioning from coal to natural gas in a lot of energy sectors, especially in China. On top of that, there were also some supply related issues as well. Then, obviously, these supply related issues, took a turn in March 2022 with the war in Ukraine, which started, and the consequences on natural gas supply from Russia. So the sanctions, the shutting down of Nord Stream 1, and prices obviously skyrocketing at this point. At this point in time, we were fearing, supply cuts and a huge impact on especially on the competitiveness of European industries. But it didn't really happen, and the prices have gone down to actually the levels that we observed in 2021. And this is because, well, first of all, we had a mild winter in Europe. The economic growth was quite low. Geraldine mentioned that earlier in China, and we were able to diversify gas supply. So again, using the same sort of method and representation than in the stocktake part, we're going to look at how has natural gas demand decreased in different sectors. So in the building sector, you see that so climate impact, this refers to what I introduced earlier, the degree days, right? So the decrease in need for heating because the temperatures were lower. The impact is not as high as earlier we were looking at 2010 and 2022. 2019 seems to have been also a relatively mild winter, so the impact is not as big. So really, the reduction in demand that we observed comes from fuel switching. Since 2019, we've seen some, we went away from natural gas overall in the building sector, and especially to the benefit of heat pumps in the European Union. A little bit of energy efficiency, this is not hugely significant. And the rest is basically what we cannot really attribute to the other drivers, and that we estimate to be basically due to behaviors or energy sufficiency. So the actual reduction, so most likely as a response to prices, but the actual reduction of energy needs in European households and the service sector. Yeah, just to note, it's the consumption of natural gas, as you see on the pie chart at the bottom. The consumption of natural gas in buildings is mostly due to heating, so either space heating or water heating. Now, looking at the industry, I will go quickly on this one. We've seen basically the share of natural gas going down since 2019, but more specifically in 2022. And some energy efficiency improvements. So I could say in this case, again, mostly energy intensity. So we've been able in the industry to reduce the share of natural gas and also to reduce energy consumption compared to the industry production. The role of activity has been quite small. There is no deindustrialization, but the increase might have been lower than we could have hoped for because of this issue with gas prices and gas supply, but still there was a slight increase in activity, even though it's not really across all sectors. For example, iron and steel has decreased quite a lot, and also the chemical sector has decreased a bit since 2019. Now looking at power generation, results that I think are quite surprising. So in terms of reducing demand, reducing natural gas consumption to produce electricity generation, one thing I found surprising is that the fuel switching effect was very little. So basically what happened is that we had a reduction in electricity consumption as a whole. Therefore, the production of electricity has decreased, which has decreased the need to produce electricity, including from natural gas. But the share of natural gas is actually the same as in 2019, which is not very intuitive because in the electricity sector, as you may know, we have a merit order. Therefore, if gas-fired power plants lose in competitiveness because of the price of gas, they should not be, they should be basically moved to the end of the pecking order and therefore not be used as much. But the problem is that there was another effect that sort of countered that, which is the fact that we had a very low availability, among other things, of French nuclear power plants, which has increased the need for other means of production, including gas-fired power plants. So contrary to what we could have expected, where there's a lot of flexibility basically in the power sector, well, we haven't really seen a huge contribution of the power sector to reducing the natural gas demand. Finally, the last lever that we're going to look at is supply. So the demand has reduced, but we were also able to diversify gas supply in Europe. So this is an estimation. It's quite difficult actually to assess what is the amount of gas that came from Russia, because it's not as straightforward as that. There can be different routes, and this is something that has increased actually since the sanction. Is that the usual pipelines are not necessarily the usual routes of exports for Russia have changed a little bit, so it's kind of difficult to track the Russian gas, but I estimate it to be around 100 BCM. And this is mostly due to increasing, well, a little bit actually from Norway as well, like an increase in importation. That's the chart that you see on the bottom left. So we've increased importation from Norway, but mostly we've increased by 60% importation from LNG, because it's quite a flexible transportation way, which we can more easily reroute, obviously, than pipelines. So this is what we've observed. Therefore, as a result, imports from Russia went down by more than a third. And as you can see on the last waterfall chart on the right, this is due to a variation of factors that we've seen together. So final consumption is a big one. The power sector is not as big as expected, but still played a role. Other consumption sectors that I haven't detailed in this analysis. Domestic production has increased, meaning that like this plus 22 means that because we had less production, this has actually increased our need for imports. But this has been, again, more than compensated by the fact that we're able to find other suppliers of natural gas. So to summarize what has been said, there's been, a huge disruptions on natural gas supply since the war in Ukraine, and even before that, and a huge impact on prices, obviously. But there were ultimately no supply outages as initially feared, because basically EU consumers adapted, and also because we were able to diversify natural gas supply chains.
And the weather was favorable in Europe.
And the weather was favorable, as we pointed out, even though, looking at 2019, it was not that huge, but still it could have been, we could have had a hard winter, which would have made things obviously more difficult. So we ended up having a decrease in domestic consumption by 12%, in industry through energy efficiency and fuel switching. In the building sector, interestingly, there was, as you said, it's now favorable weather, but also the emergence of heat pumps in the last few years, but also because of an actual reduction in energy needs, right? Efforts to actually reduce what we call energy sufficiency, so reduce actual energy needs, especially for heating. And, power generation has played a little role despite a stable level of natural gas in terms of structure of power generation. So even though consumption has fallen, this was not really enough to significantly decrease Russian imports. So what we also observe is a major diversification of supply, with most importantly an increase of LNG imports by 60%. And in total, we ended up with Russian gas imports decreasing by more than a third compared to the reference year that we used here of 2019. So that's all for me. I'll try to go quickly over this part, but I hope it was still interesting and clear.
Quentin, very insightful. Yeah, and the irony of all this is that, just days before the Ukraine war, the EU had just acknowledged natural gas as a transition energy for the transitional energy, just like nuclear. But in the end, I think it was kind of a wake-up call for the EU countries to boost the renewables deployment, and especially in terms of policy and permitting and all this, reducing permitting times and stuff like that. So yeah, very interesting. Yeah, well, it's 12:15, so I guess we just have time maybe for one remaining question, and then we'll wrap up. We have a question regarding electrification. Do you have scenarios for production of the additional electricity needed to electrify transportation and heating? The answer is yes. We do have a model named POLS, standing for Prospective Outlook on Long-Term Energy Systems. And with this model, you can actually figure out, what is required in terms of sectors to electrify. Maybe Quentin, you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, no, I
Since
guess
you're familiar with the model.
Yeah, pretty familiar with the model. Yeah, no, so I guess the question implied is that, the impact that it's going to have on electricity consumption and generation. So be able to increase the electric capacity to cover that demand. So I mean, this is something that's well covered by the different models. Obviously, there's going to be an increase in volumes of obviously electricity generation that's going to be massive. And networks investment have to be able to adapt to that. But yeah, that's basically what's at stake here on a global level.
Right. Well, thanks very much. Thank you for all contributors, and thank you for your attention. You will be receiving this presentation by email by tomorrow, I guess. So no worries, you're going to have this document at hand, and feel free to ask anytime any question to research@enerdata.net. That's research@enerdata.net, and we'll be glad to answer. And also we'll answer the remaining questions in the chat box, because there's been quite a few. All right, well, thanks very much. Thanks, Quentin. Thanks, Geraldine, and see you next time then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.